Hey, what's up YouTube? This is tcgsam here, and in today's video I've got a hand trap tier list for the post Chaos Origins format. I'll be going over how each of these hand traps will fare into the perceived best decks of the format and whether or not you should be playing them. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. Starting off with Ashe, I think Ashe, this format is still going to be a main deck staple as well. Not only is it very solid against a deck like Branded, it's also live in every single matchup, which is important when the format isn't really defined yet. And of course, Ashe is always able to stop those Mulcharmy cards, which is obviously really good. Next up is Cherries. I would say Cherries is maybe like very bottom side deck potential. I think you would need to play a very specific deck that's able to have a extra deck that's able to support this. But even then, out of all the best decks in the format, I don't think any of them losing just a single extra deck monster is going to outright kill the deck. And so ultimately, I think that maybe Cherries has a very specific niche use, but in general, I would say there are much better hand traps than this out there. Dogwood, of course, is still unplayable with the current time rules. Bell, I would say, is something with the potential to be main decked. Similar to Ashe, this card is very good in the Branded matchup. It has some applications in some other matchups as well. It's not going to be as solid as Ashe into every single matchup out there, but there are some more niche or specific edge cases that where a card like Bell could be good. For example, stopping a card like, let's say, Call By or stopping a Bestial. But I would say the biggest thing Bell has going for it is that a deck like Branded is projected to be one of the best decks of the upcoming format, and the fact that Bell is very solid against that deck means I think that this card has some potential to be played in the main deck. Droll, I would say, is something maybe towards the bottom of main deck potential. I personally still think that there are always going to be those big combo decks that are going to struggle a little bit into Droll and Lockbird, and so Droll should be somewhere in your deck. But I will say that the best decks that we have, like Branded, Cool Tune, even a deck like Elfnote or Doomsday, they all have some way around Droll and Lockbird, especially if the player knows what they're doing and is actively trying to play around it. I don't think Droll's necessarily going to be an auto win in some matchups, but I think in other matchups it's just necessary to keep those bigger combo decks in check and give yourself a chance when going second, especially since I think Droll is one of the few hand traps that can outright stop a turn on its own. For the Mulcharmies, I would say Perulia is something that's definitely going to be a side deck staple this next format. There are going to be quite a few more decks this format that enjoy summoning from the hand. A big one that comes to mind is the Ritual of Light and Darkness deck. They'll be ritual summoning a bunch from the hand. During your turn, they'll be bouncing guys back to the hand and summoning them from hand again. Against a deck like Elfnote as well, their Elfnote monsters are being summoned from the hand, and if you hit them with Perulia, it's going to make it so their end board is going to be a lot weaker than it would be otherwise. Not to mention, Perulia will always at least give you a one draw in pretty much every single matchup you play. Even against a deck like, let's say, Cool Tune or Branded, which doesn't necessarily need to play into Perulia, they have the potential to do so. And so in cases where your opponent, let's say, decides to extend harder into Perulia, or they don't really have a choice but to summon more times from the hand, Perulia is going to keep gaining extra value from that. And so because Perulia, I think, has some very good applications against specific decks, and the floor of Perulia is always just going to be replacing itself, I do think that Perulia should be in most people's side decks for this next format. Fulos is an interesting one. I would say Fulos is still definitely a very good card for this upcoming format, but something important to note is that, let's just say Branded, Cool Tune, and Elfnote are going to be the three most popular, most represented decks. All of them have a pretty solid way to play under Fua to end on a half board that is still very respectable. But that being said, though, I still do think that Fua is going to be one of the best cards in this upcoming format. Against like all of those decks, they have the potential to summon from the extra deck on your turn. And so as a result, even against these matches when let's say you draw Fulos as your 6th card, there's still some potential for Fulos to hinder them a little bit or force them to give you additional resources if they want to interrupt you. And so for all those reasons, I personally still think that Fulos is a main deck staple. Yes, you are going to run into matchups like Ritual and Light and Darkness here or there, or you're going to run into decks that are able to set up a half board pretty well, but I think it's just going to be solid into almost every single deck in the metagame. I personally think you still should be maining this card, although I can see the argument for just siding it instead. Meows, on the other hand, I think is something with like maybe a little bit of side deck potential. Can't really think of a deck that really is going to lose pretty hard to Meows other than maybe a deck like Malice, but Malice is maybe like a 5th to 10th most popular deck in the format, so I don't expect a card like Meows to be particularly good. Most, if not all, the other meta decks that we're going to see in the top 10 are not going to really lose to a card like Malice, and so I don't really think there's a spot for it in your side deck unless for some reason you really hate Malice. Phantasme, I would say, is something that is maybe like low side deck potential or do not play. There's not really a deck that really likes to link spam that is going to be super popular in my opinion, except for maybe like Malice. But just thinking about like the top 5 best decks of the format, I don't see a world where Phantasme is going to be good against any of those decks. I suppose against a deck like Sky Striker it can be good, but again, Skystriker, similar to Mouse, is just like a top 10 popular deck. It's not really a deck that you should be seeing that often. For Contact C, I think Contact C is something with like low side deck potential. There are always going to be matchups where this card is going to be pretty good into them. There could even be situations against the best decks where this card could completely stun them depending on how they open. But I think in all of these cases, there are probably just better cards to just outright stop your opponent, because not only do all these decks just naturally have a way to, let's say, clear their own bodies, sometimes some of them can just straight up use the Contact C to further their plays, and Contact C won't actually hinder them at all. Brutality C, on the other hand, I think is something with a lot more side deck potential. I don't want to say it's like a side deck staple, because I think it's only good against like a few very specific decks. The fusion decks like Branded or Dracotail, I think this card could be okay against them. You could technically side it in against like a deck like Cool Tune as well, but similar to Contact C, I think all those decks do have good ways to play around this card, especially if the player is good and is aware of this card's existence. They're likely going to play in a way where they're not really going to lose to this. And so ultimately, I think that Brutality C is probably just going to be a very niche side deck pick. If you really feel like you need extra help against those fusion based decks, then I suppose it could be okay. Cycle Read or something I wouldn't play. There isn't really a light deck right now that's really thriving. No Material, I also think, is something that's not very good. Most of the top decks can just gas straight through it. Lancia, I would say, is once again like bottom of side deck potential. I can't really think of a deck that really relies on banishing aside from Malice. They're just cards that are way better generically into that deck. Similar idea with Chaos Hunter, except Chaos Hunter I think is just straight up worse than Lancia. Mourner, I would say, is something maybe like top of side deck potential. You'll basically only play this if you want additional copies of like an Effect Negator hand trap after you're already playing a card like Imperm or Veiler. I think this card is just the worst one out of all three of them, and it's just a very niche side deck pick. Songs of the Dominators, I think, is something that actually has a little bit more potential in this format. I would put this like at the very bottom of main deck potential, because not only do you need to play a very specific deck that's able to play songs in the first place, if you are playing this card, you're also probably building your deck strictly around this card. And what I mean by that, your hand trap count is pretty much exclusively going to be trap hand traps like cards like Imperm and the other Dominus cards. So your deck needs to be able to not only support those Dominus cards, they also need to be able to play around the restrictions of songs. But off the top of my head, a deck like Power Patron can take advantage of it. So if you're playing that deck, I definitely think that playing this big Dominus package is going to be incredibly powerful. There are definitely flaws with this engine as well. The restrictions can be pretty debilitating, and as well, a card like Songs can also be hit with a card like Ash, which you never really want your hand traps to be able to be stopped with like your opponent's hand traps. Shifter, I think, is definitely still going to be a main deck staple in this upcoming format. Of course, if your deck can play it, you're probably playing it. It's just such a good card into all the best decks. Meister, I would say, is something like I wouldn't play. Yes, technically there is always a use for Meister. You can argue, hey, maybe it's the bottom side deck potential because it can be used to stop a deck like Branded, but I just think there are way better cards against that deck. Next card we're going to talk about is Nibiru, and this one I think has really fallen off in the past format for good reason. A lot of the best decks just naturally play around this card. I think there's like one argument for putting Nibiru back into your side deck, and that's when people stop playing around this card just becomes a lot better. If people are, let's say, structuring their combos in a way that plays really poorly into Nibiru because they don't think that anyone's playing this card, you can really punish them for that by actually playing this. But again, I think this card is most decks are just naturally going to have a good way around this, and it's rarely going to be impactful unless you start pairing it with multiple other hand traps. So ultimately, I think that Nibiru is a hand trap that fills a very specific niche role in our metagame, but I don't think it's going to be that popular in this upcoming format still. I think Dominus Spark is just not a really good card. There isn't really that many decks that can take advantage of it at the moment, so I probably wouldn't play it. And even then, I don't think its effect is like that great. Typhoon also, there's no reason to play this card. Token Collector, there's no tokens at the moment. Sneaky C also, no reason to ever play this card. Most decks will just have an easy way to remove it before it gets to the end phase. Veiler, I think, is something you could choose to main deck in this upcoming format. While a card like Effect Veiler is generally pretty low impact, when you pair it with other hand traps, you can just outright stop your opponent's turn, which can be really good. Of course, a caveat is always going to be the best decks are probably always going to be able to play through one or two of these like low impact hand traps most of the time. And so you definitely need multiple other hand traps if you're playing this. If you're not playing a deck like Cool Tune that can take advantage of the fact that Veiler's level 1 tuner, probably wouldn't even consider playing Veiler in the first place. There are better hand traps that are more generic and high impact. Canine Zuna, I think, is something with like a little bit of side deck potential. I don't think you'd ever actually side this as a real hand trap, and you'd only really play it in any Canine variant, so like Canine Microsoul, for example. I think the biggest problem with this card right now is that everyone is on a card like Fallen the Virtuous, and if you lose your Lupus to a Fallen the Virtuous, you lose one of the best resources that the deck has. I also don't think that summoning in rank 5 right now is particularly impactful as a hand trap. Ogre, I think, is something with a lot of main deck potential. This next format, Ogre has great applications into a deck like Branded. It's able to hit Fallen Valbaz, it's able to hit the Ecclesia Synchro. Against a deck like Doomsday, it's able to hit all the rank up cards, it's able to hit their continuous spell in certain situations against a card like Mind Shuffle. And so I think that Ogre has enough applications in this upcoming format for you to consider main decking it. You probably do need to pair Ghost Ogre with other hand traps for it to really fully stop your opponent, but I think Ghost Ogre has enough neat applications against a lot of the top decks that even as your 6th card sometimes it can be pretty good. Next up is Spark. I think Spark's a fine card similar to Songs. If your deck can play around the restrictions of it, it's definitely something I would choose to play, but it's not a card that many other decks can play, and if I am choosing to play a Dominus card, I'm probably playing a Dominus Impulse before that. Speaking of Impulse, Impulse still one of the best hand traps that we have in the game at the moment. If your deck can play it, you're 100% playing it, whereas on the other hand, with a card like Spark, even if your deck can play it, I don't think it's 100% necessary. It's just an extra option if you prefer, let's say, trap hand traps to normal ones. DD Crow, I think, is something with a little bit of side deck potential. It's probably going to shine the most into a matchup like Branded. In theory, it's generic enough to be used in almost every single other matchup, but I can't really think of a matchup where DD Crow could potentially be as impactful as into a deck like Branded, let's say. So it's not a terrible card by any means, but I don't think it'll ever be super high impact. Opening to E4 is the new Angelechy hand trap. For those of you who don't know what it does, it's this trap that says if your opponent goes first, during the standby phase, you can activate this. It lets you basically place the field spell, summon a guy, place another guy to the back row. It'll basically net you a bunch of extra cards before your opponent even plays a card a lot of the times, and will make it so they're hit with a floodgate that says your opponent can only activate up to 5 monster effects per turn. So I would say the biggest draw of opening D4 is that, of course, it gets you so much free card advantage, and that floodgate effect can be kind of nice. That being said, though, I think that most decks are going to have some ways to either circumvent the floodgate by, like, let's say, playing around it or just playing under it, or they'll just have a way to straight up remove it. It's certainly not a bad card by any means. I think this is definitely one of the most interesting hand traps that we got in recent times, but this hand trap is also pretty restrictive in the sense that you have to be playing a very specific deck that has to not only have the extra deck space for the extra deck monsters, you're also going to have to play like the main deck Angelechy spell, for example, which not every deck's going to want to do. So I think this card has some side deck potential. I could definitely see this card being solid in the future, but right now I don't think it's going to be super good. Next up, we got Vados. Vados is also something I wouldn't play at the moment. There isn't really a deck that's super reliant on their field spell. Bystials, I think, are almost, I want to say, like main deck staple worthy. I would probably put them at the very, very top of main deck potential. They're going to be great into a deck like Branded. They generally should be at least live in most other matchups. But I think the biggest thing that's carrying the Bystials is the fact that Magma is just such a good card. Not only does it get you a body on the field, it also gets you a dragon in the end phase. And there's so many decks with good dragon cards in their main deck, let's say like Doomsday or Branded, for example, that Bystial Magma almost seems like an engine piece in addition to being a non-engine. So if your deck can take advantage of Magnemut, I'd probably play the Bystials in the main deck, but if not, then it's not a terrible choice to side deck either, because it's still going to be good against a deck like Branded. For the side frames, I'll say Gamma, something like you could side deck. It's going to be pretty high impact almost every single time you're able to resolve it, but playing that driver is a pretty big downside to having access to such a powerful hand trap. So I would really only play Gamma if you feel like you want to side deck card like Delta as well. Delta's not bad by any means. There's still quite a few important spell cards in every single meta deck at the moment, but again, similar to Gamma, you have to be willing to play the driver in order to take advantage of this package. Not every deck's going to want to do that. Perhaps another downside to Delta is that it does negate the activation, and so cards that say you can only activate it once per turn, your opponent can simply activate another one, and Delta will essentially have been useless. Epsilon, of course, is still unplayable as always. Imperm, I would say, is something I want to put at like also near the top of main deck potential. Similar to Valor, if you pair with other hand traps, it can be pretty high impact, but of course, it also has that leg up on Valor where if you draw it as your 6th card, you can still at least trade 1-for-1 with one of your opponent's interruptions, so definitely not a bad card by any means. If you are choosing to play hand traps, I definitely would consider Imperm as one of my top ones. Heckhands Godos is an interesting one. It could have some potential in like certain mirror matches, especially if the monster you're taking has like very good effects as well. But I think this one card is just a little bit too niche and a little bit too hard to trigger at times. And I can't really think of a deck that's going to trigger this card like super often and also struggle into it. And so as a result, I think that this also falls into sort of like the side deck potential tier where it maybe has a few niche uses, but isn't going to be that good. Next up, we got Rescue Ace Impulse. I think this card is also something with like maybe a little bit of side deck potential. I suppose if you really want to draw cards and for some reason like your deck can't play the Charmies or you don't want to play the Charmies, I guess this is another option. But I think any of the Charmies are just straight up better than this. Harmonia is definitely a staple if your deck can play it. Good going first, can even be used going second in some circumstances. this card just trades up so well into most of the metagame that I really think there's no reason to play this if your deck can play it. Finally, Dominus Purge, I'll say, is also something with main deck potential. If you're looking for a solid hand trap, I definitely think that Dominus Purge is one that has a good enough effect. A lot of the times, this card is just going to be extra copies of Ash, but there are also other times where it could simply remove search cards that would otherwise stay on the field, like, let's say, against a card like Fairy Toe Ball, for example. So I think it does have some potential upside there. Again, only certain decks can play it, and even those decks, they may not necessarily always want to play this card, so I don't think it really goes any higher than main deck potential. So that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you guys thought about in the comment section below. I'm curious to hear what you think about the hand traps that we have in this upcoming format. Do you think any of them are underrated or overrated? Let me know in the comments below. Before I end off the video, I also wanted to let you know about Card Trader, which is an online marketplace for cards, card supplies, sealed product, things like that. You can check them out using my link in the description and use code tcgsam for 5% off your entire order, while also helping to support the channel. Finally, if you found this content helpful, then I'd really appreciate it if you consider subscribing. I'm trying to hit 15,000 subscribers by the end of 2026, and by subscribing, you let me know that you found this content helpful and you want to see more of it in the future. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.